Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Alo Wash Processed Ethiopia from Mazelab Coffee. There's the box right there. And Mazelab, based out of Prague, Czech Republic. And this coffee was featured in a recent blind taste test rankings video where it finished second place out of 6 Mazelab coffees on that day. And if you watched that video, then you saw that I was able to pick this coffee out from those coffees on that table, largely because of the cleanliness and florality that it did offer, though the Alo honey also offered plenty of that as well, just with a little bit more intensity to it. And when deciding on which coffees to pick up from Mazelab, I originally didn't pick these coffees because they actually had not been released when Airworks did offer them. So when Airworks came back and said that they had more coffees on their website that we could pick from, I immediately picked out both the Alo honey and wash, largely because of how much success we've had with the Alo coffees this year. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 52. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Once again, none of these Mazelab coffees that we're reviewing were particularly light, and some of them did turn out a little bit more developed. And that was actually the case with this coffee, as it's something you'll see throughout the entirety of this review. So once again, with this coffee, we can say that it's skewed probably a little bit on the more developed side of that medium light that we've aligned Mazelab's coffees with being. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, which was of course the blind taste test day, and this coffee definitely stood out for its clear but pronounced florality, as it is offering an abundance of Ethiopian qualities in a lighter bodied sense. It definitely stood out due to just how much more pronounced the florality was in comparison, but not quite as intense as the honey processed Alo. So I already kind of mentioned those things, but otherwise it was a pretty nice start. I did enjoy both of the Alo coffees the most on that first try. Day 23 through the Chemex, and the coffee was a little bit more developed than expected. And I do have to say that of the coffees that we are reviewing, this is probably the one I noticed it the most right from the onset, as the first time I brewed it and we went with the V60 for it, it didn't necessarily translate that heavily in the experience, and it could have been because it was the first time we'd opened it. We literally opened the bag of that coffee right before brewing it, so that might have been what happened there. But the second time that we brewed it, it was pretty prominent this time around. It's mostly clean, sugary, and citric forward yet again, but the roast definitely did seem to hinder the experience with this coffee. Day 29 through the UFO brewer, and there were more struggles with this coffee, as it does feel like it has taken a pretty sharp decline, the sharpest decline of any of the coffees that we had reviewed from that blind taste test day, as it's offering a much more generic floral feel to it, with notably less of the fruit intensity and a bit more of the roastness all around. So really have struggled with this coffee after the first time that we did brew it, and given that I had some very high expectations for this coffee given just how well it performed in that first video, it was really unfortunate to see the way that this coffee had developed over time. Day 32 through the V60 with Mazelab's recipe, so 16:1 at 93 degrees Celsius, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it has helped mitigate some of the more roasty qualities of it, allowing for a much more clear presentation of the fruit and floral qualities to it, and a little bit more peachiness to go with a lighter florality. So definitely a lot more positives this time around, and it felt like maybe this coffee would benefit from some lower extraction adjustments. Day 35 through the Chemex with Mazelab's recipe, and the coffee is still okay, as it continues to be hindered by those roasty qualities yet again, as the whole beans themselves do have such a beautiful aroma. And that's always a little frustrating, as when a coffee smells so beautiful and you can't get it to translate as well in the cup itself, as it is still marred by those roastier qualities once again. But I do have to say, I can feel a little bit of that caramelized probat-like characteristics towards the tail end of this coffee, so there are definitely still positives to it. I feel like just having had this coffee set really high expectations for itself and then not live up to those expectations was a little frustrating at times. Day 38 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was back to being at its best, which, given the best I'd experienced of this coffee was that blind taste test day, which is a V60 day brewed with our standard recipe, then it did give a little bit of credence to this coffee probably being a little better when pushed, which, I mean, it happened with the Kenyan coffee from Mazelab as well. Citric and floral qualities did stand out significantly more, with a much better defined lemon component to it, honeysuckle-like florality, and a pronounced caramelized sweetness. So that's what I'm looking for. It tasted like a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee that is roasted on a Probat. So very happy with that experience. Day 41, 3D Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's fine. It really did not perform well in this brew method, and if you've watched all of our Mazelab reviews, you've probably noticed that each of these coffees do seem to perform either really well through one brew method or the other brew method, as we just can't seem to get this coffee, any of their coffees, to be consistent across brew methods overall, which is a bit of an anomaly. I do have to say most coffee roasters, they are pretty consistent across brew methods. There's usually not this much of a deviation between them. It really seems to highlight a lot of the developed qualities when brewing it through this brew method. So not the best, citric lemon, most abundant characteristic this day. Day 44, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is at its best, as this recipe does really seem to bring out a lot of these stone fruit qualities, offering plenty of the peachiness. Strong sugariness in line with the listed panela, as there's plenty of the citric lemon, as well as a little bit of that slight roast, but given that there are an abundance of other desirable qualities to it, then it's definitely something that we can overlook. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those. Cleanliness level 4, as we mentioned with the Bonito review, that coffee was probably the cleanest of the coffees that we are reviewing from Mazelab, largely because of just how well structured and defined it was. And that's not to say that this coffee wasn't, but this coffee had a little bit more of that roastiness to it, which is why you can see the smokiness there at that level 2 mark. Even when we were able to get that toned down and mitigated ever so slightly, it was still much more abundant than it was in a lot of the other coffees. So that's why it wasn't quite as clean as the Bonito, but definitely still on the cleaner side of a lot of the coffees that we're reviewing from Mazelab. Finished level 4, that's been pretty consistent across these Mazelab coffees, but I really enjoyed the way that this coffee did finish. Even if it was a little bit more on the citric side of things, I appreciated the sweetness that offered, largely because this coffee was just very sweet overall, and that was the biggest selling point to me on this coffee roaster going into it, was that they were roasted on the Probat, and as a result I was hoping that a lot of these coffees would continue to be very sweet, and this is a good example of it. Washed Ethiopian coffees roasted in a Probat oftentimes can be like this, and I really appreciate that about this coffee. Florality level 4, an abundance of lighter floral qualities to it. I think, if I remember correctly, they have a generic floral note listed on here, but definitely seeing although a lot of those lighter florals. Honeysuckle is the one that stood out the most, as that was pretty prominent within this coffee. Citrus fruit level 4, plenty of the citric lemon, as I was expecting given the initial impressions of this coffee. Stone fruit level 4, plenty of the peachy characteristics to this coffee, both of which present in a sweeter sense. So very happy with those aspects, especially when I were able to get them in a much more intense sense. Level 3 for the caramel, as there's definitely abundance of that caramelized Probat-like characteristic to this coffee. Very happy with that on this one. Acidity level 3, not the brightest coffee. Did not expect this one to be the brightest coffee whatsoever. Berry fruit level 3, you can see there's a lot in this tasting wheel, and I can see a fair bit of those melon-like characteristics, pretty synonymous with wash-processed Ethiopian coffees, aloe coffees as well. And then the final thing worth discussing, which is the body level 2, and this is the first of the 5 Mazelab coffees that we've reviewed up to this point that does have lower than level 3 in terms of body, but of course we are working with a wash-processed Ethiopian coffees. That's fully expected. Outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, we kind of sped run through it, but it's largely because I feel like these are pretty self-explanatory. It is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one was probably my second favorite after the Bonito, as it seemed like these 2 wash-processed coffees were the only 2 that performed better as we continued to work through them, as they continued to offer. Both of them offered the characteristics that I was looking for from these coffees from this coffee roaster. So I continuously mentioned that since it is a Probat roasting coffee roaster, I want to see a lot of that sweetness, but I still want to see it present in a cleaner sense. And both these offered the most amount of sweetness and cleanliness out of any of the coffees that we're reviewing from Mazelab, which are the 2 of the 4 things that I prioritized the most. But the other of those 4 things, the florality and the fruit qualities in this one, were the most abundant out of any of the coffees other than that Bonito. So credit to them on this one. I feel like this is a very nice coffee. I feel like I've had great success with the aloe coffees, and the Bonito is significantly more enjoyable than this coffee was for me, but this one did definitely earn itself a pretty solid second place by the end. type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you really want more intense, sweeter Ethiopian coffees, and this one's a pretty good fit, largely because it offered that throughout the entirety of this coffee, even if it was with only one specific brew method that was as successful as it was. Keep in mind that some adjustments can bring out a little bit more of the development of this one, a little bit more of those roasty qualities and characteristics. So I continue to highlight the profile of these coffees, maybe not necessarily being the lightest. That's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Aloe Washed Processed Ethiopia from Mazelab Coffee. Thank you for watching.